Some places don't burn all at once. They wait for the right moment to call your name. The words echoed in the mind of Sergeant Daniel Cooper long before he ever saw the fire, long before the sky over Cedar Hollow, Montana, turned the color of dying embers at dusk. It was just past 7:40 p.m. when he rolled his black service truck down the empty county road, tires humming over cracked asphalt stretched between frozen fields and stands of pine that looked almost black against the fading light. The air outside was cold enough to sting, around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the sharp scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke from farms miles away. Daniel was 34, a United States Marine with a posture carved by discipline and years of field operations, his face weathered not by age alone, but by experiences he rarely spoke about. His short brown hair was neatly trimmed under a dark cap, and his hazel eyes carried the steady focus of someone trained to notice everything and reveal nothing. He wasn't on an active mission tonight, just a routine perimeter check near a decommissioned rural training corridor that the Corps had once used for simulation exercises. The kind of assignment that usually ended with paperwork, not stories. But something about tonight felt off in a way he couldn't define, like static before a storm. It started with light, a strange orange glow flickering beyond the tree line, too strong to be a barn fire, too uneven to be a controlled burn. He slowed the truck, his hand instinctively moving closer to the radio, but he didn't call it in yet. Not because he didn't care, but because experience taught him that not every situation announced itself the same way. That's when he saw it. A shape moving along the shoulder of the road, low to the ground, uncertain but deliberate, breaking through the haze of drifting smoke. At first he thought it was a coyote, maybe a stray animal caught too close to civilization. But as his headlights swept forward, the truth sharpened into focus. It was a German shepherd, its coat dulled by ash and dust, ribs faintly visible under matted fur, ears angled forward with an alertness that didn't match its condition. It wasn't running away from the smoke behind it. It was moving with purpose, as if the fire itself had meaning only it understood. Daniel eased the truck to a stop, engine idling, windshield wipers brushing away a light mist that had begun to form from the cooling air. The dog didn't flee. Instead, it paused in the center of the road, turning its head slowly toward him. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not fear, not aggression, but recognition. Like the animal had been waiting for this exact intersection of time and place. Daniel lowered his window slightly. The wind that entered carried the smell of burning wood and something older beneath it, something like stone heated over time. "Easy, boy," he murmured instinctively, though his voice carried no command, only caution. The dog didn't respond the way a trained canine might. It didn't sit or bark. It simply turned its head toward the direction of the fire again, then back to him, as if weighing a decision it had already made long ago. Then it moved. Not fast, not erratic, but with a steady urgency that left no room for hesitation. It crossed the road and stopped again on the opposite shoulder, looking back once more. Daniel felt it then, that quiet pull in his chest, the same kind of instinct he had learned to trust in combat zones when silence meant something was already wrong. He turned off the engine. The sudden absence of sound made the world feel sharper, the crackle of distant fire more distinct, the wind through the pines almost like whispers. The dog began to walk again, deeper into the narrow path cutting through the trees, its silhouette briefly illuminated by the fading glow behind it. Daniel hesitated only a moment longer before stepping out of the truck. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his jacket, grounding him in the present. He didn't know why he was following. There was no official order, no radio confirmation, no reason that would satisfy protocol. But the dog kept looking back, not as if it was leading a stranger, but as if it was refusing to leave someone behind who had finally been found. And so he followed. The German shepherd moved like it already knew the path by heart. Stepping off the roadside gravel and into a narrow break in the pine trees where the ground dipped slightly into uneven terrain, the kind of forgotten corridor that nature slowly reclaims when no one is watching. Sergeant Daniel Cooper followed at a careful distance, his boots pressing into damp soil that smelled of moss, burned leaves, and cold earth, each step quieter than the last as the forest swallowed the sound of the highway behind him. The glow he had seen from the road was no longer distant now. It was present in the air itself, reflecting in faint pulses across the lower branches, as if the trees were breathing in warm light and exhaling smoke. The dog never looked back in fear. It looked back in certainty, checking not if he was coming, but confirming he still was. Daniel adjusted his jacket, feeling the temperature drop a few degrees as they moved deeper, the air growing heavier, carrying a strange stillness that made even distant night birds fall silent. He had been trained to read environments under stress, to identify threats before they became visible, but this was different. This was not tactical awareness. This was something older, something instinctive that did not belong to maps or missions. After nearly 200 yards, the trees opened slightly, revealing the first clear signs of destruction ahead. The outline of a small rural church emerged through the haze, its wooden structure partially illuminated by flickering orange light that danced along its edges like a living thing. Smoke rose in uneven columns into the night sky, thinning as it climbed, disappearing into a dark canopy of stars that felt indifferent to everything below. The building was old, possibly early 20th century construction, with a simple steeple that leaned slightly to one side, as if time itself had begun to bend it. Daniel stopped walking for a moment, taking in the scene without speaking. The German shepherd stood several feet ahead, rigid now, ears forward, gaze locked on the structure. There was no hesitation in its posture, only urgency, as if every second carried weight. Daniel lifted his radio from his shoulder, hesitating before speaking, then lowering it. Again, something about this did not feel like an incident that belonged to protocol yet. Not until he understood more. The dog moved again, circling toward a side path that led closer to the church, weaving between fallen branches and patches of tall grass that swayed slightly in the heated wind. Daniel followed, his breath steady but controlled, eyes scanning instinctively for hazards as the orange glow intensified. The closer they got, the more the air changed, shifting from cool forest dampness to dry warmth, as if the fire had rewritten the atmosphere itself. Then he saw it more clearly. The church was not fully engulfed, but it was compromised in sections, with portions of the outer structure showing active flame near one of the rear extensions, while other parts remained untouched, creating a strange contrast of shadow and firelight that made the entire building feel suspended between two states of existence. The dog stopped near a collapsed wooden fence that marked the perimeter, its body tense, tail low but steady. It turned its head one final time toward Daniel, holding his gaze longer than before, as if confirming he understood the cost of what came next. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from recognition of something unspoken in that moment, a sense that this was not random, not accidental, but deliberate in its timing and placement. He crouched slightly, placing a hand on the rough wood of the fence, feeling heat radiate through it in uneven waves. "Stay back," he said softly, though there was no one else to hear the warning except the dog that had already chosen otherwise. The German shepherd did not obey in the way commands usually worked. Instead, it stepped forward into the gap between broken planks, positioning itself as if the boundary no longer applied. Daniel exhaled slowly, his training urging caution, his instincts urging action, both colliding in a way that left no easy answer. The glow from the church flickered across the dog's face, highlighting its focus, its unwavering direction, and for a brief moment Daniel understood something he could not yet explain. This was not just a location. It was a destination. And whatever waited beyond it had already been decided long before he arrived. The closer Sergeant Daniel Cooper moved toward the small church, the more the world seemed to narrow into a single point of focus where sound, light, and motion all converged into the same uneasy rhythm. The German shepherd stayed just ahead of him, no longer weaving through the forest with urgency, but moving with a deliberate calm, as if the distance between them and the structure had already been crossed in its mind long before their bodies arrived. The orange glow intensified across the uneven ground, spilling through gaps in the trees and painting the trunks with shifting bands of light that looked almost like slow-moving waves. Daniel's boots pressed into a mix of gravel and soft soil as the terrain leveled out, bringing them within clear sight of the building. The church stood partially surrounded by a narrow clearing, its old wooden frame weathered by years of wind and rain, now catching fragments of firelight along its edges. Smoke rose steadily from one side of the roof, drifting upward into the cold night air where it broke apart and disappeared into the darkness above. There were no visible signs of people outside, no movement near the entrance, only the quiet tension of an environment that had shifted out of its natural order. Daniel raised his hand instinctively toward his radio again, but paused, listening instead. There was a sound beneath the crackle of distant flame, faint but persistent, like shifting debris or something moving inside. The German shepherd stopped at the edge of the clearing and sat down briefly, its gaze locked on a side entrance partially obscured by shadows and collapsing wooden beams. It did not bark or whimper. It waited. Daniel followed its line of sight and felt a subtle tightening in his chest, the kind of response that did not come from fear, but from recognition that something unresolved was unfolding just beyond view. He stepped forward slowly, closing the remaining distance between the trees and the clearing, his eyes scanning for any immediate danger. The air grew warmer with each step, carrying the scent of heated wood and aged stone, mixed with something else he could not immediately place, something that felt personal rather than environmental. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he crouched slightly, taking in the full structure from a lower angle. The front doors of the church were still intact, though darkened by smoke, while a side section near what appeared to be a small annex showed signs of structural stress, with charred wood and shifting beams indicating recent internal activity. The German shepherd rose again and moved a few steps forward, then stopped near the broken fence line, glancing back at Daniel only once before returning its attention to the entrance. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle into a sharper focus. There was no emergency dispatch confirmation, no official alert, no external indication that anyone else was aware of what was happening here. Yet the dog's behavior suggested purpose rather than randomness, as if every movement had been directed toward a single outcome. He adjusted the strap of his tactical vest, the fabric slightly stiff from the cold air, and stepped closer to the fence line, where the ground transitioned from forest soil to packed earth and scattered gravel. The glow from inside the church pulsed faintly through small gaps in the wooden structure, casting irregular patterns across the clearing like fragments of light breaking through a fractured surface. Daniel paused again, listening. The sound he had noticed earlier became slightly clearer, no longer just noise, but faint movement layered with distance. The German shepherd turned its head toward him once more, holding the gaze longer this time, as if confirming that hesitation was no longer part of the equation. Daniel gave a small nod, more to himself than to anything else, and stepped forward into the clearing. The moment Sergeant Daniel Cooper stepped fully into the clearing, the world seemed to tighten around him, as if the forest itself had drawn a slow breath and decided to hold it. The church stood ahead at a distance of roughly 60 yards, its silhouette uneven against the night sky, with sections of its wooden exterior glowing faintly where heat had already passed through and left its mark. The air was warmer here, noticeably so, rising in subtle waves that distorted the outlines of the structure like heat rising off desert pavement. Daniel adjusted his stance, feet planted firmly on the gravel and compact soil, his eyes scanning from left to right in a steady rhythm learned through years of training in unfamiliar environments. The German shepherd remained slightly ahead and to the right, no longer moving forward, but no longer retreating either. It stood still, focused entirely on the building, as though every sense it possessed was locked onto something within that Daniel could not yet perceive. The faint sound he had heard earlier grew slightly clearer now, not loud, but consistent, like shifting wood or something moving carefully through a confined interior space. Daniel raised his hand again toward his radio, hesitating only briefly before lowering it once more. This was not yet a moment for external coordination. Something about the situation felt contained, isolated, as if the world beyond this clearing had not yet been invited into it. He took another step forward, closing the distance by a few feet, and felt the ground transition from rough soil to more compacted earth, suggesting frequent foot traffic in the past. The German shepherd suddenly moved again, not running, but advancing in a steady line toward the side entrance of the church where a narrow wooden door hung, slightly ajar. The motion was deliberate, not reactive. Daniel followed, his breathing slow and controlled, eyes locked on the same point of interest. As they approached, the structure of the church revealed more detail. The outer wall near the side entrance showed signs of stress, with darkened wood and uneven gaps between boards where heat had begun to weaken the frame. Smoke drifted out in thin streams, curling upward before being pulled away by the night wind. Daniel paused approximately 20 feet from the entrance, letting his gaze adjust to the contrast between shadow and flickering light. Inside, the interior was partially visible through the opening, but details were obscured by smoke and shifting illumination. There was movement. Again, subtle but noticeable, not chaotic, but controlled, as if something or someone inside was still navigating the space with intent. The German Shepherd sat down once more, directly facing the entrance, its posture steady, ears forward, body aligned with precision. It did not glance away this time. Daniel stepped closer by another few feet, stopping near a section of broken fence that marked the transition between outer grounds and the church's immediate perimeter. He felt the temperature rise again, not dramatically, but enough to register the proximity of heat sources within the structure. The wooden door shifted slightly on its hinge, creaking under its own weight, and that small sound carried clearly across the clearing. Daniel narrowed his eyes, focusing on the doorway. There was no visible sign of immediate danger, but the environment was unstable, unpredictable in its internal conditions. He made a slow decision to advance further, closing the remaining distance until he stood just outside the threshold of the entrance. The German Shepherd rose again and positioned itself slightly ahead, as if indicating direction rather than waiting for instruction. Daniel placed one hand lightly against the rough wooden frame of the doorway, feeling the uneven texture beneath his glove. The interior beyond remained partially hidden, but the presence of movement inside was now unmistakable, steady and deliberate, like someone searching or reaching through darkness. He leaned forward slightly, preparing to step in, fully aware that whatever lay beyond this threshold was the reason he had been brought here in the first place. Daniel Cooper felt the weight of the moment settle as he stood at the threshold of the side entrance, one hand resting against the rough wooden frame while the other hovered near his chest, steadying his breathing in a way that had become second nature over years of controlled environments and unpredictable missions. The interior beyond the doorway was dim, lit only by fragmented orange light that filtered through smoke drifting in uneven layers across the ceiling. The air here was heavier, warmer, carrying the scent of aged wood, wax, and something faintly metallic that came from old materials exposed to heat over time. The German Shepherd positioned itself slightly ahead of him, no longer moving erratically, but holding a precise stance that suggested absolute certainty in direction. It did not look back now. Its attention was fully inside. Daniel leaned forward slightly, adjusting his angle of view into the church interior. The space inside revealed itself in fragments. Rows of wooden benches extended into darkness, their surfaces reflecting flickers of firelight that pulsed from somewhere deeper within the structure. The ceiling overhead was partially obscured by smoke, which moved slowly like a suspended current, thinning and thickening in irregular patterns as air flowed through unseen openings. Daniel took a careful step forward, crossing the threshold with controlled caution, his boots making minimal sound against the worn wooden floor. The German Shepherd entered just ahead of him, moving with familiarity rather than hesitation, as if the space itself was already mapped in its mind. As Daniel advanced a few feet inside, the source of the movement he had sensed earlier became more defined. It was not random. It had rhythm, a steady shifting deeper within the structure, near what appeared to be a side chamber partially concealed behind a collapsed section of wall paneling. He moved slowly down the center aisle, eyes scanning both sides for any sign of instability or obstruction. The benches on either side were intact but aged, some slightly misaligned, suggesting the building had not been regularly maintained. The flickering light from deeper inside cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floor and disappeared into the smoke near the ceiling. The German Shepherd paused near the midpoint of the aisle, then turned slightly toward the right, directing Daniel's attention toward a narrow passage partially blocked by fallen wood beams and debris. Daniel followed the indication, stepping closer, careful to avoid unstable fragments scattered across the floor. The passage was tight, leading toward what likely had once been a small chapel room or storage area adjacent to the main hall. The air grew denser as he approached, and the temperature shifted again, suggesting proximity to the heat source affecting the building's outer sections. He stopped just short of the passage entrance, listening. The sound he had been tracking earlier now carried a subtle variation, less like movement alone and more like purposeful activity within a confined space. Daniel raised his head slightly, focusing through the smoke and shadows, and for the first time since entering the structure, he felt the certainty that whatever awaited beyond this narrow opening was not incidental. It had meaning, and it had been waiting to be found. The German shepherd stood beside him now, still and alert, as if confirming that this was the exact point where the path would change direction. Daniel Cooper moved carefully into the narrow passage, his boots pressing into uneven wooden flooring that creaked softly under controlled weight. Each step measured with the kind of precision that came from years of navigating unstable environments where sound and movement could reveal more than intended. The German shepherd remained close, slightly ahead and to the right, guiding rather than rushing, its body angled toward the deeper interior of the structure where the air felt denser and warmer, as if the building itself was breathing in slow, uneven cycles. The corridor narrowed further, forcing Daniel to adjust his posture slightly as he advanced, one hand brushing lightly against the rough wall to maintain orientation through the smoke that drifted in thin, shifting layers. The smell intensified here, a mixture of aged timber, soot, and faint traces of wax that suggested this section of the church had once been used for storage or private gatherings rather than open services. The subtle sound he had been tracking earlier now became more distinct, a soft but steady movement that suggested presence rather than collapse or structural shift. It was consistent, controlled, and deliberate, echoing faintly through the confined space ahead. Daniel paused for a brief moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the reduced visibility. The German shepherd stopped as well, holding its position just before the final bend in the passage, ears forward, body tense but stable, as if confirming that the destination was no longer uncertain. Daniel leaned slightly forward, peering around the corner into a small interior chamber partially illuminated by flickering light that filtered through cracks in the wooden exterior wall. The space was modest, likely an auxiliary room connected to the main hall, with old storage shelves lining one side and scattered remnants of forgotten items along the floor. Smoke was thinner here, rising in slow spirals toward a ceiling that showed early signs of heat exposure but had not yet collapsed. In the center of the room stood a simple wooden structure, partially obscured by shadow and debris, around which the faint movement he had sensed earlier now became clearly defined. It was not chaotic or random. It was intentional. Daniel stepped forward carefully, crossing the threshold into the chamber, his attention fixed on the source of movement while maintaining awareness of the surrounding structure. The German shepherd entered immediately after him, positioning itself slightly to the side, its gaze locked on the same focal point without hesitation. As Daniel approached, the outline of what occupied the center of the room became more visible. It was a storage arrangement, partially collapsed but still intact in sections, with items that appeared deliberately placed rather than scattered by accident. Among them were objects that did not belong to a fire scene or emergency environment, but rather to something preserved, hidden, or intentionally maintained over time. Daniel slowed his pace further, lowering his center of gravity slightly as he assessed the space. There were no immediate signs of danger, but there was undeniable evidence of recent activity within this sealed chamber. The air here felt different, less chaotic, more contained, as if the room had been separated from the rest of the structure in both function and purpose. The German shepherd took a few steps forward, then stopped again, focusing on a specific point near the far wall where a faint shift in shadow suggested something partially concealed behind stacked materials. Daniel followed the line of sight, his expression tightening slightly as he registered the subtle irregularity in the arrangement. He took one final step closer, careful and deliberate, as the realization settled that what they had followed was not just movement through a burning structure, but a deliberate path leading to something carefully hidden within it. Daniel Cooper stepped deeper into the chamber, his movements slow and controlled as his eyes adjusted to the uneven contrast of smoke and flickering light that clung to every surface inside the small hidden room. The German shepherd remained at his side now, no longer leading, but fully alert, positioned in a way that suggested both protection and guidance at the same time. The air felt heavier here, not because of fire alone, but because of the enclosed stillness that made every small sound more noticeable, every shift in shadow more pronounced. Daniel scanned the far wall again, focusing on the subtle irregularity he had noticed earlier. The stacked materials there were not random debris from collapse or heat damage. They were arranged too carefully, too deliberately, as if someone had maintained order even in the middle of chaos outside this space. He took another step forward, boots pressing softly against the worn wooden floor, and the German shepherd mirrored his movement with equal caution, its gaze locked on the same point of interest without deviation. As Daniel approached within roughly 10 feet of the far wall, the composition of the space became clearer. There were wooden crates, some old and reinforced, others simpler and worn, arranged in a layered structure that suggested long-term storage rather than temporary placement. Between them, partially obscured by shadow and smoke, was a narrow opening in the wall paneling that did not align with the architecture of the church itself. It was too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be structural failure. Daniel stopped again, narrowing his focus as he studied the opening. The German shepherd stepped forward slightly, then paused, its body angled toward the gap as if confirming what it already understood. Daniel felt a shift in his awareness. A quiet recognition that whatever existed behind that opening was not part of the building's original purpose. He moved closer, closing the remaining distance with careful steps until he was directly in front of the concealed section. The air here was warmer still, suggesting proximity to the outer fire-affected walls, but the interior of this hidden space remained relatively intact. Daniel raised a hand and gently tested the edge of the paneling near the opening. It gave slightly under pressure, revealing that it had been modified rather than broken. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, watching intently, its focus unwavering. Daniel leaned forward just enough to peer through the narrow gap, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior beyond. What he saw was not destruction, nor immediate danger, but a carefully maintained space that stood in stark contrast to everything surrounding it. Shelving units lined the interior, holding items that appeared preserved rather than abandoned, and at the center of the space was a small table-like surface with objects arranged in a deliberate pattern. There was no sign of panic, no indication of hurried evacuation. Instead, everything suggested intention, organization, and secrecy maintained over time. Daniel's expression tightened slightly as he absorbed the implication of what he was seeing. The German shepherd moved closer to his side, positioning itself near the opening as if ready to enter without hesitation. Daniel paused, his training urging caution while his instincts pointed toward resolution. The chamber beyond was not simply a hidden room within a burning structure. It was something else entirely, something preserved with purpose, waiting for discovery. He shifted his stance, preparing to move through the narrow opening, aware that whatever truth lay beyond it had already drawn them both too far to turn back. Daniel Cooper stepped through the narrow opening with extreme care, his shoulder turning slightly to pass through the modified paneling, the rough edge of aged wood brushing against his tactical vest as he entered the concealed space beyond. The German shepherd followed immediately, moving without hesitation, its body slipping through the gap with practiced ease, as if it had done so before or had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside, the atmosphere changed again, becoming quieter, more contained, and noticeably cooler compared to the heat lingering in the outer chamber. The air carried a faint stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the fire outside, as if this space existed in a different timeline entirely. Daniel paused just inside the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust fully. The room was small but carefully maintained, with shelves lining both sides, each holding objects that were arranged with intentional order rather than neglect. Wooden crates, labeled and stacked, occupied the lower sections, while the upper shelves contained items wrapped in cloth or sealed in protective containers that had clearly been preserved over time. At the center of the room stood a simple wooden table, and upon it lay several carefully placed items that immediately drew Daniel's attention. He moved closer, step by step, his movements controlled and deliberate, scanning the arrangement for any indication of immediate danger while simultaneously trying to understand its purpose. The German Shepherd advanced slightly ahead of him now, stopping near the table and lowering its head briefly, as if acknowledging something familiar or significant. Daniel's gaze fixed on the objects. There were documents, aged but intact, along with what appeared to be identification materials and photographs carefully arranged in a pattern that suggested categorization rather than randomness. The presence of such materials inside a hidden chamber within a rural church raised immediate questions in Daniel's mind, questions that did not yet have answers but demanded attention. He reached the edge of the table and stopped, not touching anything yet, simply observing. The smoke from outside was faint here, seeping through small gaps in the structure, but it did not interfere with visibility. The lighting came from a combination of distant fire glow and a small, protected source within the room that Daniel had not yet fully identified. The German Shepherd shifted slightly to the right side of the table, then looked back at Daniel, maintaining eye contact for a brief moment before returning its focus to a specific section of the arrangement. Daniel followed its line of sight and noticed a single item placed slightly apart from the others, positioned with clear intention rather than accident. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his focus, and felt a subtle shift in his understanding begin to form, as if the purpose of the hidden room was beginning to reveal itself piece by piece rather than all at once. The atmosphere remained still, but charged with meaning, as Daniel stood between the outer chaos of the burning structure and the quiet, deliberate order of the concealed space, realizing that whatever truth had been protected here was now fully within reach. Daniel Cooper stood motionless for a moment inside the concealed chamber, the weight of everything he had seen settling into a quiet stillness that felt heavier than the smoke drifting through the broken structure outside. The German Shepherd remained near the table, unmoving now, its attention fixed on the carefully arranged materials, as if confirming that the final piece of something long in motion had finally been reached. Daniel slowly exhaled, his gaze moving across the surface of the table once more, taking in the documents, the photographs, and the deliberate organization that suggested not chaos, but preservation. The items were not recent in appearance, yet they had been maintained with care, protected from time, heat, and neglect. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching anything, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on a single document placed at the center of the arrangement. It was positioned differently from the rest, almost as if it had been intended to be the focal point of whoever eventually found this place. The German Shepherd shifted its stance slightly, moving closer to Daniel's side, its body angled toward the same document. Daniel hesitated, then carefully reached forward and lifted the edge of the paper, revealing aged text and markings that immediately altered the tone of everything he had understood up to this moment. His expression changed, subtly, not into shock, but into recognition, as if fragments of a long-buried memory were aligning with the present in ways that were difficult to immediately process. The room remained silent except for the faint, distant sound of the structure outside continuing to burn, a reminder that the world beyond this hidden space was still unstable and unresolved. Daniel set the document back down slowly, his hand steady but deliberate, and looked toward the German Shepherd. The animal did not move, did not react with excitement or fear, but instead maintained a calm, focused presence that suggested understanding rather than confusion. Daniel took a slow step back from the table, allowing himself a wider view of the room again. The arrangement of materials no longer felt random or merely historical. It felt intentional in a way that suggested connection to something larger than this location alone. He turned his attention briefly toward the entrance behind him, where faint orange light still flickered through the cracks of the concealed wall, reminding him that time outside this chamber continued to move forward regardless of what had been discovered within it. The German Shepherd finally moved, stepping closer to Daniel and stopping just in front of him, its eyes steady and direct. In that moment, Daniel understood that the reason he had been led here was not simply to observe, but to witness something that had been carefully preserved for a purpose that extended beyond the fire, beyond the church, and beyond the present moment itself. He lowered his hand slightly, not touching anything further, but acknowledging the significance of what lay before him. The silence between them was complete, broken only by the distant crackling of wood outside, as the truth of the hidden chamber settled fully into place.